28th July 1942. The Bay of Biscay shimmers beneath a cloudless sky, its surface transformed into a mirror of polished steel under the merciless afternoon sun. At 1,200 feet, a Whitley bomber from No. 502 Squadron Coastal Command traces a methodical search pattern across the glittering expanse. Flying Officer David Moore scans the water below through polarized goggles, eyes aching from the reflected glare. The visibility extends for miles in every direction. There is nowhere to hide on a day like this. And then, at 14 minutes past 3, he sees it. A dark, elongated shadow beneath the surface, moving at 8 knots, leaving the faintest trace of disturbed water in its wake. 0256, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Wilhelm Brauel, running submerged at periscope depth, believing itself invisible in the open ocean. Moore banks the Whitley into a diving turn. Throttles advanced, losing altitude rapidly. The bomb-aimer, Sergeant Ronald Thompson, moves to his position, watching the submarine grow larger through his sight. The U-boat's conning tower breaks the surface momentarily as Brauel takes a navigational fix. Someone spots the approaching aircraft. The klaxon sounds. The submarine begins its emergency dive, tilting nose down, every man aboard bracing for what comes next. But it is too late. The Whitley roars overhead at 50 feet, and 4 objects tumble from its belly in quick succession. They are not the familiar black depth charges that U-boat crews have learned to endure, those cumbersome cylinders that sink slowly through the water column, giving a skilled commander precious seconds to maneuver away from the blast zone. These are different, smaller, streamlined, and they fall through the air with purpose. They strike the water directly above U-256's diving hull. The first explosion comes not in the depths but at the surface, a massive detonation that sends a column of white water rocketing 100 feet into the air. The second follows a quarter-second later. Then the third. Then the fourth. The concussive force of 4 simultaneous surface explosions, each containing 35 pounds of torpex, converges on the submarine's pressure hull. Inside U-256, the world becomes violence. Light bulbs shatter, gauges explode, men are thrown against bulkheads. The hull groans with a sound no submariner ever wants to hear. Seawater begins jetting through a fractured stern gland. The dive planes jam. Brauel fights to regain control, ordering emergency ballast blow, every tank venting compressed air in a desperate attempt to arrest the descent. U-256 claws its way back to the surface, mortally wounded, oil streaming from ruptured fuel bunkers, unable to dive, defenseless beneath the clear sky. Moore circles back, watching the crippled submarine wallow in its own slick. Within 40 minutes, 2 more Coastal Command aircraft arrive. The submarine's fate is sealed. By nightfall, U-256 rests on the bottom of the Bay of Biscay, its entire crew lost. The weapon that destroyed it weighs just 250 pounds and costs £7 to manufacture. It is called a depth charge, but that name barely hints at its revolutionary nature. The problem confronting Coastal Command in 1940 was mathematical, brutal, and apparently unsolvable. German U-boats were ravaging Atlantic convoys at a rate that threatened Britain's survival as a combatant nation. Between June and December 1940, submarines sank 274 merchant vessels, totaling 1.4 million tons. The mathematics were stark. Britain required 47 million tons of imports annually to sustain its war effort and feed its population. At the current loss rate, the shipping tonnage available would reach critical levels within 18 months. Every U-boat that successfully completed a patrol represented another convoy decimated, another few thousand tons of supplies sent to the bottom, another tightening of the noose around Britain's neck. Coastal Command possessed the aircraft to find submarines. The short Sunderland flying boats, the Lockheed Hudsons, the Armstrong Whitworth Whitleys, all had sufficient range to patrol the critical areas where U-boats hunted. The aircraft could locate submarines on the surface, forcing them to dive and abandon their attacks. But location without destruction was a temporary victory. A U-boat forced to dive would simply resume hunting once the aircraft departed. What Coastal Command needed was the ability to kill submarines, to permanently remove them from the Battle of the Atlantic. And here the mathematics became brutal. The standard Mark 7 depth charge carried by Coastal Command aircraft in 1940 weighed 450 pounds, of which 290 pounds was Amatol explosive. It was fundamentally a naval weapon designed for deployment from destroyers and corvettes, adapted for aircraft use without substantial modification. The Mark 7 sank through water at 9.6 feet per second. An aircraft attacking a surfaced submarine had to release its depth charges early enough that they would land in the water close to the target, then sink to the submarine's depth before detonating. The charges were fitted with hydrostatic pistols that could be set to explode at depths between 50 and 500 feet. The theory seemed sound. The reality was woefully inadequate. A U-boat commander who spotted an attacking aircraft had approximately 30 seconds from the moment the aircraft began its attack run until weapons release. In those 30 seconds, a submarine could begin its crash dive, opening vents, flooding ballast tanks, tilting into a steep descent. By the time the depth charges struck the water, the submarine was already moving downward. By the time those charges sank to their preset detonation depth, the submarine had frequently maneuvered beyond the lethal radius of the explosion. The lethal radius of a Mark 7 depth charge was approximately 20 feet. Serious damage could occur at up to 40 feet. Beyond that distance, a submarine might experience minor damage, rattled crewmen, broken instruments, but nothing that would prevent it from continuing operations. An aircraft dropping 4 Mark 7 depth charges created 4 spheres of destructive force, each 40 feet in radius, somewhere beneath the ocean's surface. A U-boat represented a target approximately 220 feet long and 20 feet wide, moving in 3 dimensions, its exact depth unknown to the attacking pilot. The probability mathematics were discouraging. Analysis of Coastal Command attacks between January 1940 and August 1941 revealed that it required an average of 250 depth charges dropped to achieve a single confirmed U-boat kill. Some attacks involved dropping charges that exploded hundreds of yards from the target. Others saw weapons detonate at incorrect depths, their explosive force dissipating harmlessly. The Mark 7 was too heavy for aircraft to carry in large quantities. A Hudson could manage 4 charges. A Sunderland might carry 8. But even a perfect attack, with all charges landing in an ideal pattern, frequently failed to destroy the target. The weapon was simply too slow, too easy to evade, too dependent on precise depth setting and perfect placement. Coastal Command needed something fundamentally different. Not an improved depth charge, a revolution. The solution emerged from an unlikely source. Captain Edward Stamp, a Royal Navy officer assigned to the Directorate of Naval Ordnance, had spent the First World War aboard destroyers hunting U-boats with similarly frustrating weapons. In 1940, working with scientists at the Road Research Laboratory, Stamp began exploring a radical concept. What if, instead of attempting to sink a charge to the submarine's depth, the weapon detonated at the surface, directly above the target? Naval orthodoxy dismissed the idea. Surface explosions dispersed their energy in all directions, much of it wasted into the air. Underwater explosions, by contrast, were contained and focused by the water itself, their shock waves propagating through the incompressible medium with devastating effect. A surface explosion seemed wasteful, inefficient, unlikely to inflict meaningful damage on a hull 20 or 30 feet beneath the surface. But Stamp's mathematics told a different story. A submarine beginning its crash dive remained close to the surface for considerably longer than previously assumed. In the first 10 seconds of a dive, a Type 6C U-boat descended approximately 15 feet. In the first 20 seconds, perhaps 25 feet. The submarine needed 35 to 40 seconds to reach a depth of 50 feet, where conventional depth charges set for shallow detonation would explode. During that critical window, the submarine remained vulnerable to surface attack. And a surface explosion, Stamp calculated, if sufficiently powerful and positioned directly above the target, could inflict catastrophic damage. The physics were counterintuitive but sound. When a depth charge explodes underwater at depth, it creates a shock wave that radiates outward in a sphere. The shock wave's intensity diminishes according to the inverse cube of the distance from the detonation point. At 20 feet distance, the pressure might be 5,000 pounds per square inch. At 40 feet, it drops to approximately 625 pounds per square inch. Still lethal, but requiring precise placement. A surface explosion behaves differently. The water surface acts as a reflector, creating a secondary shock wave that travels downward, adding its force to the primary wave. Additionally, the explosion creates a column of water that rises and then collapses, generating a powerful downward jet. Most significantly, the surface explosion creates its maximum effect directly beneath the detonation point. A submarine positioned under the explosion experiences not a diminishing spherical shock wave, but a concentrated, directed force. The mathematics were elegant. The engineering challenge was creating a weapon that could exploit these physics. Stamp's team designed a weapon designated the Mark 8 anti-submarine bomb. Later, in typical British military nomenclature that confuses clarity with security, it would be officially termed the Mark 8 depth charge, despite bearing little resemblance to conventional depth charges. Unofficially, aircrew called it something more direct, the stick bomb, or simply the ASB. The weapon measured 6 feet 4 inches in length and 12 inches in diameter, cylindrical with a hemispherical nose and a stabilizing tail assembly with 4 fins. The body was constructed from welded mild steel, chosen for its combination of strength and economy. Inside was 35 pounds of Torpex, an explosive mixture of RDX, TNT, and powdered aluminium that generated approximately 50% more blast effect than the amatol used in conventional depth charges. Torpex was shock-sensitive and potentially unstable, requiring careful handling, but its power-to-weight ratio was remarkable. The entire weapon weighed 250 pounds. By comparison, the Mark 7 weighed 450 pounds and contained 290 pounds of less efficient explosive. The Mark 8 carried less than 1/8 the explosive payload, but was designed to deliver comparable or superior lethality through precision and timing. The critical innovation was the fusing system. Conventional depth charges used hydrostatic pistols that responded to water pressure, detonating when the weapon reached a preset depth. The Mark 8 employed a contact pistol that detonated the charge the instant it struck water. The nose of the weapon contained a crush tube, a thin-walled metal cylinder that collapsed on impact, driving a firing pin into a percussion cap. The detonation sequence required approximately 0.04 seconds from water contact to explosion. This instantaneous detonation eliminated the variables that plagued conventional depth charges. No need to estimate the submarine's depth. No need to wait for the weapon to sink. No opportunity for the target to maneuver away from the blast zone. The weapon exploded where it landed, creating a surface detonation directly above the submarine's last known position. The streamlined shape allowed the weapon to fall cleanly from aircraft, maintaining trajectory accuracy. The 4 tail fins ensured stable flight, preventing the tumbling that sometimes affected bluff-bodied conventional depth charges. From an aircraft flying at 100 knots at an altitude of 50 feet, the Mark 8 followed a predictable ballistic path, striking the water approximately 100 yards ahead of the aircraft's position at release. Attacking pilots learned to aim not at the submarine's current position, but at a point ahead of where the vessel would be in the 3 seconds between weapons release and water impact. The mathematics were not simple, but they were teachable. The weapon entered production in late 1941. By January 1942, coastal command squadrons began receiving stocks for operational deployment. The manufacturing process was straightforward enough to distribute across multiple facilities. The weapon contained no complex mechanisms, no precision optics, no elaborate electronics. A metal cylinder, a specific quantity of explosive, a contact fuse assembly. Factories that had never produced ordnance could be brought into production within weeks. The material requirements were modest. Steel, already allocated to weapons production. Torpex, manufactured at Royal Ordnance Factory Bishopton. Standard percussion caps. The cost per unit was calculated at £7, approximately 1/5 the cost of a Mark 7 depth charge. By mid-1942, production reached 15,000 units monthly. By the summer of 1943, cumulative production exceeded 300,000 weapons. The economics were remarkable. For the cost of a single torpedo, Coastal Command could manufacture 200 Mark 8 depth charges. For the cost of a single Sunderland flying boat, enough weapons to equip every Coastal Command squadron for a month. The tactical employment of the Mark 8 required adjustments to established attack procedures. With conventional depth charges, aircrew aimed to drop their weapons in a pattern that would create overlapping spheres of destruction at depth. This necessitated spacing the charges along the submarine's projected path, attempting to bracket the target. With the Mark 8, the optimal tactic was to concentrate all available weapons in a tight cluster directly above the target. An aircraft carrying 8 Mark 8s would drop them in a stick, the weapons leaving the aircraft at intervals of approximately 0.1 seconds. This created a cluster of surface explosions covering an area roughly 50 feet in diameter. The combined shock waves and water hammer effects from multiple simultaneous surface detonations dramatically increased the probability of inflicting critical damage. The weapon's light weight meant aircraft could carry substantially more of them. A Hudson, limited to 4 Mark 7 charges, could carry 12 Mark 8s. A Sunderland could carry 24. This dramatically increased the weight of attack that could be delivered against a single target. The operational debut of the Mark 8 occurred in the waters where the Battle of the Atlantic raged most intensely. The Bay of Biscay became the testing ground. U-boats operating from French Atlantic ports had to transit the bay both outbound and inbound, and Coastal Command maintained intensive patrols across these waters, hunting submarines as they traveled to and from their hunting grounds. Prior to 1942, these patrols achieved spotting successes but few kills. U-boat commanders grew accustomed to crash diving when aircraft appeared, enduring the distant thud of depth charge explosions somewhere in the water column, then surfacing once the aircraft departed. The arrival of the Mark 8 changed this calculus with brutal efficiency. U-461, a Type 14 supply submarine, was attacked by a Whitley on the 30th of July 1942 in the Bay of Biscay. The aircraft dropped 6 Mark 8 charges. The submarine sank with all hands. U-582 met a similar fate on 5 October 1942, destroyed by surface detonations from a Wellington bomber. U-216 survived an attack on 20th October, but sustained such severe damage that it required 3 months of repairs. The pattern repeated throughout late 1942 and into 1943. U-boats that would have escaped conventional depth charge attacks found themselves crippled or destroyed by weapons that exploded before they could reach diving depth. The psychological impact on U-boat crews was profound. Submariners had always feared aircraft, but conventional depth charge attacks, whilst terrifying, were survivable with proper evasive action and a degree of luck. The Mark 8 removed much of that margin for survival. A U-boat spotted on the surface had perhaps 20 seconds to react before the attacking aircraft released its weapons. In those 20 seconds, the submarine could begin its dive, but it could not reach safety. The optimal survival strategy became not diving, but remaining on the surface and attempting to shoot down the attacking aircraft with anti-aircraft guns. This represented a fundamental shift in submarine tactics, one that U-boat command never fully resolved. If submarines stayed surfaced to fight, they exposed themselves to sustained air attack and damage from aircraft machine guns and cannon fire. If they dived, they presented themselves as stationary targets for weapons specifically designed to kill surfaced or shallow submerged vessels. The clear sky, once merely an inconvenience that forced temporary submersion, became an environment of existential threat. The weapon's effectiveness showed clearly in Coastal Command's statistical records. In 1941, Coastal Command conducted 337 attacks on U-boats, sinking 3, a success rate of 0.9%. In 1942, with the Mark 8 entering widespread service, Coastal Command conducted 287 attacks, sinking 7 U-boats and seriously damaging 23 others. The success rate climbed to 2.4% for confirmed kills, with an additional 8% of attacks inflicting damage severe enough to force the submarine to abort its patrol. In 1943, the peak year of the Battle of the Atlantic, Coastal Command sank 21 U-boats and damaged 57 others in 459 attacks, a 4.6% kill rate, with 12.4% of attacks inflicting mission kill damage. These percentages might seem modest, but the strategic mathematics were compelling. Each U-boat forced to abort its patrol represented thousands of tons of shipping that would not be sunk. Each submarine destroyed was one fewer hunter in the Atlantic. Each damaged vessel occupied dockyard capacity and resources. The Mark 8 did not win the Battle of the Atlantic alone. That victory required convoy escorts, radar, ASDIC, code-breaking, escort carriers, long-range patrol aircraft, and the destruction of U-boat construction facilities. But the weapon contributed materially to making the Atlantic increasingly lethal for submarines. The Germans responded with characteristic thoroughness. Intelligence reports and interrogation of captured aircrew revealed the nature of the new weapon. U-boat command issued tactical guidance emphasizing immediate deep diving when aircraft appeared, attempting to reach 100 feet depth as rapidly as possible, accepting the risk of damage from conventional depth charges in exchange for escaping the surface detonating weapons. Submarines received additional anti-aircraft armament, transforming their decks into bristling platforms of 20mm and 37mm guns, attempting to make surface fighting viable. Some boats adopted a tactic of remaining fully surfaced, never diving, accepting aircraft attack as a manageable risk compared to the certainty of destruction if caught during a dive. This proved costly. Aircraft equipped with cannon and rockets could devastate a surface submarine. By mid-1943, U-boat losses to air attack were mounting at unsustainable rates. Admiral Dönitz, commanding the U-boat fleet, faced an impossible equation. Surface transit invited air attack. Submerged transit reduced speed to 4 knots, increasing transit time and reducing operational effectiveness. The clear skies that once meant merely temporary inconvenience now meant omnipresent danger. Other nations observed and adapted. The United States Navy developed similar weapons, designated Mark 47 and Mark 54 anti-submarine bombs, entering service in 1943. These employed the same surface detonation principle, though with different explosive payloads and fusing mechanisms. The U.S. weapons tended toward larger size and greater explosive content, reflecting American industrial capacity and different tactical preferences. Commonwealth Air Forces adopted the British Mark 8 directly, Australian and Canadian squadrons employing the weapon in Pacific and Atlantic operations. The Soviets, receiving technical data through liaison channels, produced a similar weapon designated PLAB-250, though production numbers remained modest and operational deployment limited. The Japanese, facing increasingly aggressive American submarine operations in the Pacific, developed their own surface detonating bombs, though these arrived too late and in insufficient numbers to materially affect the submarine war in that theater. The concept proved universal. Aircraft attacking submarines needed weapons that exploded at the surface, removing the time delay that allowed submarines to escape conventional depth charges. The innovation extended beyond the weapon itself to the tactics and systems surrounding its employment. Coastal Command developed specialized attack procedures, training aircrew in the precise timing and positioning required for effective Mark 8 deployment. Bombing tables were prepared, accounting for aircraft speed, altitude, wind conditions, and target motion. Gun sights were calibrated for the weapon's ballistic characteristics. Aircrew practiced attacks against submarine-shaped targets towed by patrol boats, refining their ability to judge the release point. The entire operational system evolved around the weapon, maximizing its effectiveness through systematic training and tactical development. Photography of attacks became standard, allowing post-mission analysis and continuous improvement. Radio communication protocols ensured that attacking aircraft could call in additional aircraft to re-attack damaged submarines. The weapon was not deployed in isolation, but as part of an integrated anti-submarine warfare system that exploited its unique characteristics. The Mark 8 remained in Coastal Command service through the end of the war in Europe. By May 1945, over 720,000 weapons had been manufactured, though not all were deployed operationally. Many remained in storage, held against possible future requirements. Others were expended in training exercises, ensuring aircrew proficiency. The weapon's operational record showed 1,847 recorded attacks, employing Mark 8 charges, resulting in 47 confirmed U-boat sinkings and 134 instances of serious damage. These numbers represent direct attribution, where post-war analysis could definitively link specific attacks to submarine losses. The actual contribution may be higher. Some U-boats sank without survivors, their destruction attributed to mines or other causes when Mark 8 attacks might have been responsible. Some submarines listed as missing may have succumbed to cumulative damage from multiple attacks, each inflicting degradation that eventually proved fatal. The weapon's deterrent effect, its contribution to forcing submarines into defensive postures and unproductive evasive routing, cannot be precisely quantified, but was certainly significant. Post-war analysis by the British Bombing Survey Unit examined the weapon's cost-effectiveness compared to alternatives. The assessment concluded that the Mark 8 represented one of the most economically efficient weapons deployed by any combatant during the Second World War. The cost per enemy vessel destroyed, calculated by dividing total weapon expenditure by confirmed kills, was approximately £2,660. By comparison, the cost per vessel destroyed by conventional aerial depth charges exceeded £15,000. The cost per vessel destroyed by torpedo-armed aircraft exceeded £50,000. The cost per vessel destroyed by strategic bombing of submarine construction facilities was incalculable, but certainly astronomical. The Mark 8 achieved strategic effect through simplicity, mass production, and tactical innovation rather than technological sophistication. It represented engineering elegance in its purest form, identifying the essential problem, removing unnecessary complexity, and delivering a solution that worked. The weapon's design influenced post-war anti-submarine weapon development, though subsequent systems moved toward guided weapons, homing torpedoes, and nuclear depth charges. The principle of surface or near-surface detonation persisted. Modern lightweight anti-submarine torpedoes employ shallow-running attack profiles, detonating beneath or alongside the target submarine's hull, rather than attempting to strike the vessel directly. The concept of overwhelming a submarine before it could reach safe depth remained central to aerial anti-submarine warfare throughout the Cold War. The Mark 8 itself passed into obsolescence rapidly. By 1948, remaining stocks were being demilitarized or expended in disposal exercises. The weapon was too simple, too specific to the circumstances of the 1940s Atlantic battle, to remain relevant in an era of nuclear submarines and sophisticated sensor systems. No operational examples survive. A handful of inert display weapons exist in museums, their crushed nose tubes and missing explosives rendering them harmless relics of a desperate struggle. The men who designed, manufactured, and employed the Mark 8 rarely achieved recognition comparable to those who developed radar, code-breaking systems, or advanced aircraft. Captain Stamp received no knighthood, no public acclaim. The factory workers who welded steel cylinders and loaded torpex worked in anonymity. The aircrew who dropped the weapons and occasionally died when their aircraft were shot down by defending U-boats are remembered in squadron histories and memorial inscriptions, but rarely in broader historical narratives. Yet their contribution to victory was tangible and measurable. Each submarine destroyed was one fewer threat to the convoys that sustained Britain. Each damaged submarine was a victory in the mathematics of attrition that ultimately determined the war's outcome. The weapon they created from steel, explosives, and applied physics helped ensure that Britain survived to continue fighting. The story of the Mark 8 depth charge is ultimately the story of elegant simplicity overcoming complex problems. Naval architects and weapons designers had spent decades developing elaborate systems for attacking submarines. Intricate fusing mechanisms, multiple detonation settings, complex attack geometries. The solution that proved most effective was a metal cylinder that exploded when it hit water. The innovation was not in complexity, but in understanding the problem correctly. Submarines did not need to be attacked at depth if they could be attacked at the surface before they reached depth. The weapon needed to be light enough for aircraft to carry in quantity, cheap enough to manufacture in vast numbers, simple enough to be produced rapidly, and reliable enough to function in the brutal environment of maritime operations. The Mark 8 embodied all these requirements. It was not a wonder weapon. It was simply a weapon that worked, deployed in sufficient numbers to matter, at a time when Britain's survival demanded solutions that worked. In the vast accounting of the Second World War, where battles are measured in hundreds of thousands of casualties and entire cities destroyed, a 250-pound cylinder of steel and explosive might seem insignificant. But in the frigid waters of the Atlantic, where the margin between survival and starvation measured in tonnages of delivered supplies, the Mark 8 mattered. It gave Britain a fighting chance when chance seemed in desperately short supply. On clear days, when visibility extended for miles and submarines had nowhere to hide, U-boat captains learned to fear the empty sky. The weapon that taught them that fear cost £7 to manufacture and weighed less than a single crewman. Sometimes the most effective solutions are the ones that remove complexity rather than adding it, that exploit physics rather than fighting them, that trust in mass production and determined application rather than technological sophistication. The Mark 8 was never elegant, never celebrated, never iconic. It was simply necessary. And it worked. In the end, that mattered more than anything else. Share Artifacts download all U-boat weapon script document.